In early 1945, thousands of German prisoners of war were being held in camps across Britain under the authority of the British War Office. Life inside these camps ran on routine. Roll call in the morning, roll call in the evening, work details, letters, lights out. According to British POW administration records from 1944 and 1945, assemblies outside these hours were rare. They were usually reserved for transfers, security concerns, or disciplinary action. So when prisoners in one British camp were ordered out of their barracks after midnight during the winter of 1945, it immediately felt wrong. No warning had been given. No explanation followed. Floodlights along the perimeter fence were switched on, turning the compound into a field of harsh white light. Armed guards took up positions around the yard. Men stepped outside half awake, pulling thin coats around themselves. Winter records from across England that year show freezing temperatures were common at night. Former prisoners later described frost on the ground and breath turning to mist as they stood in line. They were ordered into rows. Names and prisoner numbers were read from the camp register, a standard document used in every British POW camp. At first, everything seemed routine. Then one name was called. When it was spoken, two guards stepped forward and separated that man from the group. No charge was read. No destination was announced. No reason was given. From the prisoner's perspective, it was impossible to know what it meant. Being taken away at night could signal many things: transfer, interrogation, medical review, or something worse. British camp authorities did not usually explain internal security decisions unless formal punishment was involved. The selected prisoner was escorted away under guard. The rest were ordered back to their barracks. Lights were turned off. Conversation was forbidden. By morning, his place in the sleeping quarters was empty. In many camps, names removed from internal lists were crossed out quietly in pencil. No notice was posted. No statement was made. In official records, such removals were often summarized in neutral language: transfer initiated or administrative review, without further detail available to prisoners. What remains historically clear is this: unexpected midnight assemblies happened. Individual prisoners were removed under guard. Explanations were rare. Uncertainty spread quickly. Inside closed camps, information traveled slowly. Rumors filled the gaps, and silence followed moments like these. Not because the men did not care, but because none of them knew whether speaking would make things worse. That night, one name had been called, and nothing about it was explained. What was happening inside these camps in 1945 was not simply administration. It was pressure management. British authorities were responsible for tens of thousands of prisoners. At a moment when the war was ending, governments were changing, and accountability for wartime actions was becoming urgent. They were expected to screen for extremists, identify potential war criminals, prevent internal violence, and prepare for mass repatriation, all at the same time. Under those conditions, clarity became a liability. Every explanation required paperwork. Every appeal created delay. Every discussion invited dispute. So information was restricted, not always to punish prisoners, but to keep the system moving. Silence was efficient, and efficiency mattered more than reassurance. For the prisoners, this system created a hidden moral trap. To cooperate fully meant answering questions about others. To stay silent meant risking suspicion. To defend a friend meant drawing attention to yourself. There was no safe position. The system forced men to choose between truth and safety, loyalty and survival, speech and silence. Many chose silence, not because they agreed with everything around them, but because silence carried the lowest immediate risk. That is how moral pressure works inside closed institutions. It doesn't demand betrayal. It makes betrayal seem like the only way out. Power in these camps rarely appeared as open violence. It worked quietly, through files, through transfers, through reviews, through sealed records. A clerk could change a classification. An officer could approve a move. A stamp could isolate someone for months, and no single person was fully responsible. Responsibility was spread so thin that it almost disappeared. The guards were part of this system too. Most were following orders in an environment where questioning decisions could damage their careers. They were instructed not to discuss security matters, not to speculate, and not to intervene. Caring openly carried risk. So many learned to look away. Not because they were cruel, but because caution was safer than compassion. Inside this silence, rumors became a form of survival. Men compared notes, tracked absences, interpreted small signs, built theories. This wasn't idle gossip. It was an attempt to understand a system that refused to explain itself. Even wrong information was better than none. It gave people something to prepare for. And this pattern did not end in 1945. It appears wherever institutions combine security pressure, high volume, and limited transparency, in detention centers, refugee processing facilities, and modern prisons. Different era, same logic, restricted information, quiet removals, diffuse responsibility, silent witnesses. The most lasting damage was not administrative. It was psychological. Men learned to stay invisible, to avoid questions, to avoid attention, to avoid defending others publicly. Those lessons followed many of them home. They shaped how they trusted authority, how they spoke, how they remembered the war. This phase of the story matters because it shows that what happened was not random. It was structural. It was predictable. It was the result of a system that ran on silence. And once that system was in place, anyone inside it could disappear without explanation at any time. The gap between who these men were on paper and who they were in daily life was not just a human detail. It was a structural problem. British camp administration depended on simplified categories. Thousands of prisoners had to be processed, monitored, and evaluated with limited staff and limited time. Files reduced individuals to rank, unit, and capture date because anything more complicated slowed the system. But human behavior does not fit neatly into forms. A teacher who shared food, a clerk who mediated arguments, a farmer who protected weaker men. None of this appeared in official records. So the system learned to judge people without knowing them. That gap created a quiet moral dilemma. Prisoners understood that how they were seen by authorities often mattered more than who they actually were. A single accusation, rumor, or misinterpretation could outweigh years of decent behavior. This forced men to make difficult choices. Should you help someone if it risks drawing attention? Should you speak up if silence is safer? Should you defend a friend if it may cost you protection? Inside closed systems, survival often depends on invisibility. So many learned to stay quiet, not because they lacked conviction, but because conviction carried risk. The system also shaped relationships inside the camps. Because official files ignored character, prisoners had to create their own informal hierarchies based on trust. Reputation became a form of currency. Being known as reliable or fair could mean protection. Being seen as unpredictable could mean isolation. These informal networks filled the space left by bureaucracy. They were fragile, and they could collapse overnight. When a man with strong internal respect was removed, it unsettled everyone. It suggested that decency offered no guarantee of safety. That realization was powerful. It taught prisoners that moral behavior and institutional security were not the same thing. This dynamic did not exist only in POW camps. It appears wherever large institutions manage people at scale, in detention systems, refugee processing, prisons, and military facilities. When speed and control become priorities, individuality becomes inconvenient. People are processed, not understood, and once that happens, good character becomes invisible. The most troubling consequence was psychological. Men learned that being decent did not protect them, that being helpful did not make them safer, that loyalty to others might be punished. Over time, this reshaped how people related to one another. Caution replaced openness. Silence replaced honesty. Distance replaced trust. The system did not just hold prisoners, it rewrote social behavior. That is why this stage of the story matters, because it shows how ordinary people are quietly reshaped by bureaucratic pressure, not through force, through classification, through omission, through indifference. And once that process begins, no file can fully capture what is lost. The routines inside these camps were not just about order. They were about psychological survival. British administrators relied on strict schedules because they were managing thousands of prisoners with limited staff, limited resources, and constant oversight. Predictable systems made camps easier to control. They reduced conflict. They simplified supervision. But for the prisoners, routine served a different purpose. It created the feeling of continuity. When days followed a pattern, life still felt connected to the world outside the wire. Morning roll call led to work. Work led to meals. Meals led to letters. Letters led to memories of home. Time still made sense. That mattered more than comfort. Because when time loses structure, hope collapses. This created a hidden tension between institutional efficiency and human need. From the system's perspective, routine was a management tool. From the prisoner's perspective, it was emotional protection, and neither side fully controlled it. Every delay in mail, every canceled work detail, every unscheduled assembly disrupted that fragile balance. For prisoners, this raised a moral dilemma that rarely appears in official records. Should you cling to routine, even when it makes you compliant, or should you resist, even if resistance brings punishment and isolation? Many chose compliance, not because they agreed with captivity, but because routine was the only stable ground they had left. This is how control works in closed institutions. It does not rely only on fences and guards. It relies on predictable habits that people come to depend on. Once dependence forms, disruption becomes power. When a man was removed at midnight, the shock was not only about his fate, it was about the message. The rules you rely on can vanish at any moment. Your sense of normality exists only at our discretion. That message reshaped behavior. Men became cautious. They avoided drawing attention. They learned to value invisibility. They learned that emotional survival sometimes meant moral retreat. The broader implication is uncomfortable. Systems that appear humane on the surface, with sports, mail, worship, and work, can still exert deep psychological control. Kindness and structure do not cancel power. They can reinforce it. By making confinement feel manageable, routine can make injustice easier to endure and easier to ignore. This pattern did not end in 1945. It appears wherever institutions use stability to regulate vulnerable populations. In modern detention centers, refugee camps, and prisons, order becomes a substitute for accountability. Predictability becomes a substitute for transparency, and people learn to live inside limits they did not choose. That is why this part of the story matters, because it shows how ordinary life can exist inside extraordinary confinement, and how easily stability can become a form of quiet control. By 1944 and 1945, British prisoner administration was no longer operating in normal wartime conditions. It was operating under overload, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, limited trained staff, political pressure from allies, public scrutiny at home, fear of extremist networks. Under that weight, institutions do what they always do. They simplify. Files replace people, categories replace judgment, procedure replaces reflection. This was not driven by cruelty. It was driven by risk management. Officials were judged not by how many mistakes they corrected, but by how many dangers they failed to prevent. Releasing the wrong man could become a scandal. Holding the wrong man rarely did. So the system learned to err on the side of restraint. That choice created a hidden moral dilemma for everyone inside it. For officers, do you trust your own assessment or the file in front of you? Do you release someone who seems harmless or protect your career? For guards, do you question an order or carry it out quietly? For prisoners, do you cooperate and risk being labeled an informer or stay silent and risk suspicion? No option was clean. Every path carried personal cost, and the system rewarded the safest choice, not the most just one. Over time, this produced what historians call administrative inertia. Once a man was flagged, the system resisted change. Reversing a decision required more effort than maintaining it. So uncertainty hardened into permanence. Suspicion became identity. Paperwork became destiny. What makes this especially dangerous is how invisible it is. There is no dramatic confrontation, no shouting officer, no public trial, only memos, stamps, reviews, and waiting. Power operates quietly, and because it looks procedural, it feels legitimate. This is why individual suffering inside such systems often goes unnoticed. No single person causes it. Everyone is just following process. This pattern did not end with World War II. It appears in modern intelligence systems, immigration screening, counterterrorism databases, and mass detention programs. Whenever security pressure meets large populations, the same logic emerges. Better to restrain too many than release one too soon. Safety becomes more important than fairness. Risk avoidance becomes moral justification, and people become collateral to caution. It was engineered by structure, by incentives, by fear of failure, by institutions designed to protect themselves first. Once that machinery was in place, midnight removals were inevitable, not because someone wanted them, but because the system made them the easiest outcome. This stage of the system was where confinement stopped being physical and became psychological. Up to this point, control had been exercised through fences, schedules, and paperwork. Now it moved inside people's heads. Interrogation was not only about gathering information, it was about uncertainty. A prisoner rarely knew why he was being questioned, what evidence existed, or how his answers would be judged. That lack of clarity created constant self-surveillance. Men began monitoring their own words, replaying conversations, second-guessing silences, correcting themselves in private. The system no longer needed to watch everyone. People learned to watch themselves. This was not accidental. Large security institutions under pressure often rely on this effect. When staff are overstretched and information is incomplete, psychological compliance becomes more efficient than physical control. Fear fills the gaps that manpower cannot. This created a deep moral dilemma. For prisoners, every conversation became a risk calculation. Do you tell the truth and risk implicating someone? Do you stay vague and risk being seen as evasive? Do you refuse and risk isolation? None of these choices protected both conscience and safety. The system made moral clarity dangerous. For officers and interrogators, a different dilemma existed. They were expected to identify threats without full information, under time pressure, and with little tolerance for error. Releasing the wrong person could damage careers. Holding the wrong person rarely did. So caution became the default ethic. Risk avoidance replaced justice. And over time, procedure replaced judgment. What makes this phase especially powerful is how invisible it is. There are no scenes of violence, no shouting, no public punishment. Only quiet rooms, typed notes, and closed folders. Yet these were the moments that shaped lives. A sentence misread, a hesitation misinterpreted, a rumor recorded. Each could follow someone for months or years. This logic did not end with POW camps. It appears wherever intelligence systems, detention facilities, and security bureaucracies operate at scale. Modern counterterrorism lists, immigration watch databases, surveillance profiles. They all work on the same principle. Incomplete information, preserved indefinitely, treated as truth. Once suspicion enters a file, it becomes hard to remove, and the human being behind it slowly disappears. Not through cruelty, through process, through incentives, through systems designed to avoid embarrassment rather than seek understanding. By this point in the story, the prisoner is no longer just confined. He is being reshaped, learning what not to say, learning when to disappear, learning that safety depends on staying unreadable. And that lesson, once learned, rarely disappears. During the first half of 1945, British prisoner of war administration entered a period of repeated reassessment. Historical research and post-war administrative studies describe ongoing cycles of review as authorities balanced security screening with preparations for repatriation. Files were not treated as final. They were revisited. Prisoners who had already been interviewed could be summoned again for clarification or further questioning. Surviving records and memoirs indicate that earlier statements were sometimes re-examined alongside newer reports. Regional administrative correspondence from the period shows that camp officers were instructed to maintain updated security records and report changes in behavior or classification. Inspection teams visited camps to assess administrative and security procedures. Surviving inspection summaries from 1945 emphasize file maintenance and political screening as areas of attention. Transfers between camps and labor detachments were common during this period. Transport records and post-war studies confirm frequent movement of prisoners across Britain, particularly in the months leading up to repatriation. Some individuals experienced multiple relocations within a single year. Each transfer required new registration entries and updated assessments. Memoirs from former POWs describe how such moves often triggered renewed questioning. One former prisoner later recalled, "Every move meant new questions. You never knew if it was better or worse." At the same time, formal planning for repatriation had begun. Documents from early 1945 outline general procedures for medical examination, identity verification, and security clearance prior to release. These processes were coordinated with Allied authorities and international agencies. In some camps, prisoners were informed that their status was under review. In others, changes in housing or work assignments signaled that files were being processed. However, such signals were not guarantees. Historical studies note that incomplete records and unresolved security concerns frequently delayed repatriation. Administrative discussions reflected uncertainty over which prisoners could be cleared without risk. As a result, files could advance and then stall. Diaries and memoirs from 1945 reflect this pattern of hope and delay. One entry from a POW held in Britain during 1945 reads, "They say my papers are moving. Then they stop. Then they start again. No one tells me why." Within this system, written assessments carried significant weight. Positive work reports or favorable evaluations could support clearance. Negative or ambiguous remarks could prolong review. Post-war analyses acknowledged that subjective judgments sometimes influenced outcomes. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, administrative pressure increased. Regional commands sought updated processing statistics. Central authorities requested faster resolution of cases. Historical accounts indicate that this often led to additional rounds of review, rather than immediate release. For some prisoners, these processes resulted in clearance and repatriation. For others, continued reassessment extended detention. From the perspective of those inside the camps, repatriation did not always feel like steady progress. It felt conditional, dependent on paperwork, dependent on decisions made elsewhere, and often beyond immediate explanation. Mid-1945 marked more than an administrative shift. It marked a quiet admission. For the first time, the system acknowledged, without ever saying so openly, that many of its earlier judgments might have been flawed. Files were reopened, not because someone suddenly became compassionate. They were reopened because the political and military context had changed. During wartime, suspicion was useful. After victory, it became a liability. Holding thousands of men without clear justification no longer served a strategic purpose. It created diplomatic risk, legal exposure, and moral discomfort. So the system adjusted, not by apologizing, by reviewing. This reveals how institutions deal with error. They rarely confront it directly. They reprocess it. Old decisions are not declared wrong. They are quietly replaced. Earlier accusations are not disproved. They are reevaluated. Language softens. Responsibility dissolves. No one is blamed. Yet lives have already been shaped. This created a powerful moral dilemma. For administrators, do you defend earlier decisions and protect institutional reputation, or do you correct them and admit years of unnecessary restriction? For prisoners, do you trust a system that once judged you unfairly, or do you remain guarded, knowing how easily opinion can shift again? Neither choice offers closure. Correction does not erase harm. Reclassification does not return lost time. What makes this moment so important is that it exposes the difference between justice and resolution. Justice requires acknowledgement. Resolution requires only paperwork. The post-war review process offered resolution. It rarely offered justice. Files were cleared, men were released, but explanations were scarce. Mistakes were not discussed. Systems moved forward without reckoning. This pattern repeats throughout modern history. After wars, after intelligence failures, after wrongful detentions, Institutions promise reform, then reorganize, then rename procedures, then move on. Individuals carry the cost, not as confession, as revision, not as accountability, as adjustment. It also explains why hope inside such systems is fragile. When relief arrives without transparency, it never feels secure. If suspicion can disappear quietly, it can also return quietly. So even as men prepared to go home, many remained cautious. They had learned that safety depended less on who they were than on how their files were read. And that understanding does not fade easily. By late 1945, the physical war was over. But inside the camps, a quieter conflict was unfolding. The system had shifted from suspicion to review, from permanent classification to possible release. Yet that shift did not remove pressure, it intensified it. Because now freedom appeared close enough to touch, and that closeness changed everything. When release feels distant, moral choices remain abstract. When release feels near, every decision becomes urgent. The system did not openly demand betrayal. It did something more subtle. It linked cooperation to progress. It linked silence to delay. No written rule said, inform on others, but the structure made the incentive clear. That is how bureaucratic pressure works. It rarely forces a choice outright. It arranges the consequences so that one option becomes easier than the other. This created a moral dilemma with no clean answer. If a prisoner provided information to accelerate his clearance, was he protecting his family or betraying another man? If he refused to speak, was he preserving loyalty or sacrificing months of lost time at home? Both choices carried cost, and neither guaranteed success. What makes this moment so powerful is that it reveals the hidden strength of institutional leverage. The camps no longer needed barbed wire alone. They had something stronger: hope. Hope became the pressure point. Letters from Germany describing hunger, illness, and destruction did not just bring sorrow. They sharpened urgency. Every report of a sick parent or a ruined house turned delay into moral weight. The system did not create those hardships, but it sat between prisoners and their resolution. That position gave it power. This pattern is not unique to wartime detention. It appears wherever institutions control access to freedom: immigration systems, security watch lists, parole boards, intelligence databases. In each case, compliance can accelerate relief. Resistance can delay it. The choice is rarely framed as betrayal versus integrity. It is framed as cooperation versus complication. And that framing shifts responsibility away from the institution and onto the individual. No one is beaten. No one is publicly punished. Yet men are forced to weigh loyalty against survival. They are asked to calculate the value of friendship against the value of home. That calculation leaves marks, even after release, even after paperwork is cleared. Because when survival depends on navigating incentives rather than standing on principle, trust erodes, not only in others, but in oneself. The tragedy of this phase is not only that some men remained behind, it is that many learned that freedom could be negotiated. And once freedom becomes negotiable, certainty never fully returns. By the time a prisoner reached the gangway, the war had already been decided. What remained was administration. And administration, in this case, held the final power. The climax of this story is not dramatic in the traditional sense. There is no courtroom, no speech, no confrontation. There are lists, stamps, signatures, health checks, head counts. The system that once classified men as risks now determined their freedom through technical verification. That is the quiet force of bureaucracy. It does not argue, it processes, and in processing, it decides. What makes this moment so revealing is how impersonal it is. Years of suspicion, months of uncertainty, sleepless nights, moral compromises, all of it condensed into a checklist. If the form is complete, you go home. If the form is incomplete, you return to the barracks. No hatred is required. No cruelty is visible. Only procedure. This is where system pressure becomes most visible. Earlier in the story, pressure came from interrogation and uncertainty. Now it comes from finality. There is no negotiation at the gangway, no space for explanation. If a discrepancy appears, even at the last moment, the machine does not hesitate. It reverts to caution. That caution reflects institutional logic. Releasing the wrong person is a visible failure. Delaying the right one is a quiet one. So the system protects itself. Now the question is not whether to cooperate, it is whether to trust. For prisoners who cleared the final checkpoint, relief was immediate, but fragile. They had seen how easily files could shift, how quickly a name could disappear from a list. Even at the edge of freedom, certainty was thin. For those removed at the last moment, the psychological impact was deeper. Hope had already been rehearsed, bags packed, farewells spoken. To be turned back after that is not simply delay. It is emotional whiplash, and the system registers it as a clerical adjustment. This pattern echoes far beyond 1946. Modern institutions operate in similar ways. Immigration approval letters reversed at airports, watch list flags discovered at security gates, parole decisions rescinded at final review. Each moment is procedural. Each moment feels personal. The broader implication is clear. When freedom is controlled by layered systems, the final decision rarely feels human. It feels technical. And that technical framing shields the institution from moral scrutiny. No one individual denies release. The process does. Not through force, through paperwork, through repetition, through quiet compliance with procedure. And once freedom becomes a matter of administrative completion rather than moral judgment, the distance between justice and processing grows wide. For some men, that final stamp meant home. For others, it meant another season behind wire. And the difference was measured in ink. By 1947, the camps were closing. The wire came down, the watchtowers disappeared, the files were boxed and stored. On paper, the system had completed its task, but systems are judged by outcomes, not procedures. And the outcome here was not closure, it was displacement. Years of captivity cannot be undone by transport schedules. Delayed lives cannot be restored by stamps and signatures. From an administrative perspective, the mission was accomplished. Prisoners processed, camps dismantled, budgets closed, reports filed. From a human perspective, the story had barely begun. Men returned to cities that no longer existed, to families reshaped by loss, to economies that could not absorb them. The system delivered bodies. It could not deliver belonging. This is the deeper cost of prolonged detention. It fragments identity. A person learns to survive inside structure, schedules, and supervision, then is released into chaos. No orientation, no transition, no psychological support, just expectation. Go back to normal, but normal no longer exists. This is where system pressure shows its long-term shape. During captivity, pressure was overt: interrogation, review, delay. After release, pressure became invisible: rebuild quickly, adapt quietly, do not burden society. Former prisoners were expected to reintegrate without disrupting recovery. Trauma was inconvenient. Silence was rewarded. The moral dilemma did not end at release. It simply changed form. Do you speak about what happened and risk being misunderstood or dismissed? Or do you remain quiet and carry it alone? Many chose silence, not because they had healed, because there was no space to be heard. Institutions rarely plan for emotional aftermath. They plan for logistical completion. That gap is where long-term damage grows. After wars, after internments, after refugee crises, governments close facilities, declare success, move on. Individuals carry the residue. Modern societies still operate this way. We celebrate processing numbers. We praise case resolution. We rarely measure psychological cost. We rarely count lost confidence, broken trust, or delayed adulthood. This story matters because it shows that freedom delivered too late is never complete. Repatriation without restoration is unfinished justice. Closure without care is administrative convenience. And when institutions mistake paperwork for healing, they leave generations managing the consequences. The camps closed, but the system's influence followed men home, into their families, into their work, into their memories, and in many cases, into their silence. By the early 1950s, the machinery of detention had been dismantled. The fences were gone, the files were stored, the budgets were closed. To administrators, the episode was complete. But in institutional memory, nothing ever truly ends. It becomes a reference point, a template, a justification. It evolved. The procedures used to classify, monitor, delay, and release prisoners became models for later security structures. Not because they were perfect, because they were workable. They showed how large populations could be controlled quietly, legally, and with minimal public attention. That lesson endured. During the war, pressure was obvious: interrogation, surveillance, confinement. After the war, pressure became structural. Regulations, databases, clearance systems, risk categories. No one needed to shout. The system spoke for itself. The moral dilemma also changed. For officials, the question was no longer how to detain. It was how to justify detention within law, how to make extraordinary control appear ordinary. For citizens, the question became whether safety was worth surrendering transparency, whether security justified opacity, whether trust in institutions should replace scrutiny. These questions did not vanish in 1949. They became permanent. This is why the Geneva Convention reforms matter. They were not simply humanitarian victories. They were boundaries drawn around power. Limits negotiated because experience had shown what happens when systems operate without them. But boundaries only work when societies insist on them. When fear rises, they are tested. Sometimes quietly relaxed, sometimes reinterpreted, sometimes ignored. The legacy of this story is visible in every modern detention debate. Immigration holding centers, counterterrorism prisons, preventive detention laws, watch lists, risk scoring. Each echoes the same logic. We will restrict first, review later, explain if necessary. This story matters because it shows where that logic leads, not to overt tyranny, to administrative normalization, to control without spectacle, to power without accountability. It also explains why former prisoners remained cautious long after release. They had learned something unsettling, that freedom could be suspended by process, that identity could be overwritten by files, that truth could be delayed indefinitely. Once learned, that knowledge does not fade. For societies, the warning is clear. Systems do not become humane by accident. They become humane only when challenged, only when documented, only when remembered. When memory fades, procedure hardens, and power expands. Who watches the systems that watch us? Who audits the files that define us? Who speaks when procedure replaces justice? The camps closed, but the logic behind them did not. It waits, quietly, for the next crisis. And whether it dominates again depends on what we remember now.